My name is Rachel, 30 years old, working as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized tech company in Portland. I live with my boyfriend David in a charming two-bedroom apartment overlooking the Willamette River. We'd been together for 4 years, and to most people looking in, we seemed like the ideal modern couple. David worked as a financial analyst downtown, always impeccably dressed in his tailored suits, carrying that confident air that made heads turn when we walked into restaurants together. But beneath that polished exterior, something had been shifting for months, creating cracks in what I once believed was our solid foundation. It started with small things. Phone calls that would end abruptly when I entered the room. Weekend work trips that seemed to multiply without explanation. Late nights at the office that stretched longer and longer, with David coming home smelling like someone else's perfume, claiming it was from crowded elevators or client meetings. When I'd mention these observations, he'd look at me with that practiced expression of concern and say, "Rachel, you're being paranoid again." You know how demanding my job is right now. The word paranoid became his favorite weapon. Every time I noticed something off, every time my intuition whispered that something wasn't right, David would deploy that single word like a shield. "You're paranoid." It was his answer to everything. My concerns about the mysterious credit card charges, paranoid. Questions about why he suddenly needed privacy when using his laptop, paranoid. Wondering why he'd started going to the gym at odd hours, paranoid. For months, I let that word chip away at my confidence. I began second-guessing every instinct, every observation, every feeling that something fundamental had changed between us. David was skilled at making me feel like the problem, like my natural awareness was actually a character flaw that needed correction. He'd shake his head with that patient smile and say, "I love you, but you really need to work on trusting me more." The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in March. David was supposed to be at a client dinner, something about quarterly projections and budget reviews. I was home alone, catching up on some campaign reports when my phone buzzed. A text from my friend Jessica, who worked at a marketing firm across town. "Hey girl, saw David at Meridian tonight with a gorgeous brunette. Looked pretty cozy. Everything okay?" My heart stopped. Meridian was an upscale wine bar downtown, the kind of place David and I used to go for special occasions. I stared at that message for what felt like hours, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was work-related. Maybe Jessica was mistaken. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But deep down, I knew. That quiet voice I'd been silencing for months suddenly roared to life. All those times he'd called me paranoid, all those moments when my gut told me something was wrong, they crystallized into one undeniable truth. I wasn't paranoid, I was perceptive. I didn't confront David that night when he came home at nearly midnight, spinning another elaborate story about client negotiations running late. Instead, I listened to his detailed account of the fictional dinner, noting how easily the lies rolled off his tongue. He even complained about the boring conversation and terrible food at a restaurant he'd never actually visited. The next morning, after David left for work, I sat at our kitchen table with my coffee growing cold and made a decision. I was done being gaslit. I was done being called paranoid for noticing what was right in front of me. If David wanted to play games, I'd show him exactly how observant his supposedly paranoid girlfriend could be. I started paying attention in ways I'd never allowed myself before. Not because I enjoyed being suspicious, but because I deserved to know the truth about my own life. I noticed that David's gym bag, which used to smell like sweat and old sneakers, now carried hints of floral shampoo. I observed how he'd started taking his phone into the bathroom during showers, something he'd never done in 4 years together. Most telling was his behavior during our conversations. David always been someone who looked me directly in the eye when we talked. But lately, his gaze would dart away whenever I asked about his day. He'd become animated and detailed when discussing work projects that supposedly kept him busy, but vague and dismissive about the people spent time with. One evening, while David was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. The preview notification showed a message from someone named Victoria. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow night. Same place as usual, hands?" My trembled as I read those words. This wasn't paranoia. This was evidence. I didn't unlock his phone. I didn't need to see more. Instead, I sat there feeling a strange mix of vindication and heartbreak. Vindication because every instinct I'd been told to ignore had been absolutely correct. Heartbreak because the man I'd loved for 4 years had been living a double life while convincing me I was losing my mind. When David emerged from the bathroom, towel around his waist, hair still damp, I looked at him with new eyes. He caught my expression and immediately went on the defensive. "What's wrong now?" "You look upset about something." I laughed at almost the predictability of it. Even caught in the act of deception, his first instinct was to make me the problem. "Nothing's wrong," I said calmly. "Just thinking about dinner plans for tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" David paused, and I watched his face carefully. "Oh, right, tomorrow's Friday. I might be running late from work again. Big presentation to prep for." Another lie, delivered so smoothly it would have been if I didn't already know the truth. I nodded and smiled. "No problem. Maybe I'll invite someone over to keep me company." The next day, I did something I'd never done in our entire relationship. I called David's office and asked to speak with him, claiming it was about a family emergency. His assistant, Janet, was apologetic but confused. "I'm sorry, but David took a personal day today. He said he had some important appointments to handle." "Important appointments?" "With Victoria, no doubt." I thanked Janet and hung up, my suspicions now confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. David wasn't at work. He was wherever he always went on these mysterious evenings, probably preparing for another romantic dinner while I sat at home being told I was paranoid. That's when I decided to stop being reactive and start being strategic. If David thought I was paranoid for noticing his lies, I'd show him what real observation looked like. I wasn't going to scream or throw accusations or beg for explanations. I was going to do something much more powerful. I was going to let the truth speak for itself. I spent that afternoon crafting a plan that would reveal everything without me having to say a single word. David loved to control narratives, to make me doubt my own perceptions, to position himself as the reasonable one dealing with an overly suspicious girlfriend. But what would happen if I removed myself from that equation entirely? What would happen if I created a situation where his own actions would tell the story? I picked up my phone and started typing a text message to Victoria. It was surprisingly easy to find her number through David's LinkedIn connections and some basic social media research. Professional networking had made it simple to discover that Victoria Chen worked in event planning for a luxury hotel group downtown. Her profile showed a stunning woman with long dark hair and an infectious smile, exactly the kind of person who would catch David's attention. My message was simple and professional. "Hi Victoria, this is Rachel, David's girlfriend. I hope this doesn't seem strange, but I was wondering if you'd like to join us for dinner tomorrow night. David has mentioned you several times, and I'd love to meet the person who's been such a good friend to him lately. Would 7 o'clock work for you?" I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Within 20 minutes, my phone buzzed with her reply. "Hi, Rachel. I'm so surprised to hear from you. David never mentioned he had a girlfriend. This is actually quite awkward. I think there might be some confusion here." Her response told me everything I needed to know. David hadn't just been hiding his relationship with Victoria from me. He'd been hiding me from Victoria. In his carefully constructed fantasy world, I simply didn't exist. I texted back quickly. "Oh, how strange. We've been together for 4 years. Maybe he's been modest about our relationship. Either way, I'd still love to meet you. I'm making his favorite dinner tomorrow night, and it would be wonderful to have company." The pause was longer this time. When Victoria finally responded, I could practically feel her confusion through the screen. "Rachel, I really think we should talk. There seems to be a significant misunderstanding here. Could you call me?" Instead of calling, I sent one final message. "Why don't we sort it all out tomorrow over dinner? I'll text you the address, 7 o'clock sharp. I promise it will be illuminating for everyone involved." As I set down my phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. For so long, I'd been trapped in David's version of reality, where my perceptions were flawed and my instincts were symptoms of paranoia. But now I was stepping out of that twisted narrative and into the truth. The stage was set. Tomorrow night, David would walk into our apartment expecting another evening of lies and manipulation. Instead, he'd find Victoria sitting at our dinner table, and his carefully constructed world of deception would collapse around him. No more gaslighting, no more being called paranoid. Tomorrow, his own face would explain everything he'd been hiding. I spent the rest of Friday preparing for what would either be the most awkward dinner party in history or the most liberating evening of my life. I cleaned our apartment with meticulous care, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I needed the ritual of it. Each surface I wiped down, each pillow I fluffed, felt like I was preparing for battle in the most civilized way possible. The menu was simple, but deliberate. David's favorite herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. If this wasn't special, nothing was. I set the table for 3, placing the extra chair directly across from David's usual spot. Every detail mattered now. This wasn't just dinner, this was theater. And I was both the director and the lead actress in a play I'd never wanted to star in. At 6:30, I changed into the navy dress David had bought me for my birthday last year. The one he said made my eyes look stunning. Tonight those eyes would be watching very carefully as his world unraveled. I applied lipstick with steady hands, surprised by my own composure. Months of being told I was paranoid had actually prepared me for this moment. I'd been rehearsing doubt and uncertainty for so long that stepping into absolute certainty felt like finally exhaling. Victoria arrived first, exactly at 7. I watched from the window as she stood outside our building, checking her phone, clearly debating whether to go through with this. She was even more beautiful in person than in her photos, wearing a cream-colored blouse and dark jeans, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. When she finally rang the buzzer, her voice through the intercom was tentative. "Rachel, it's Victoria. I'm still not entirely sure what this is about, but I'm here." I buzzed her up, my heart pounding with anticipation rather than anxiety. When I opened the apartment door, we stood facing each other for a moment, 2 women who had unknowingly been sharing the same man. Victoria's eyes were kind but wary, and I could see she was genuinely confused about the situation. "Please, come in," I said, gesturing toward the living room. "Thank you for coming. I know this must seem very strange." Victoria stepped inside, looking around at the apartment with obvious recognition. Her eyes lingered on the photos of David and me scattered throughout the room, our 4-year relationship displayed in frames on every surface. The confusion on her face deepened into something closer to alarm. "Rachel," she said slowly, "I think there's been a serious mistake. David told me he was single. He's been telling me that for 3 months. 3 months." The timeline aligned perfectly with when his behavior had started changing, when the late nights and mysterious phone calls had begun. I nodded calmly, pouring 2 glasses of wine from the bottle I'd opened to let it breathe. "That's exactly what I suspected," I replied, handing her a glass. "David has a talent for creating different versions of reality depending on his audience. With me, you don't exist. With you, I don't exist. Tonight, we both exist in the same room, and he'll have that." Victoria accepted to explain the wine but didn't drink it. She was staring at a framed photo from last Christmas, David and me wearing matching sweaters at his parents' house, both of us laughing at something his mother had said. The evidence of our relationship was everywhere, undeniable, and documented. "This is insane," she whispered. "He told me he'd been focusing on his career, that he wasn't ready for anything serious, but enjoyed spending time with me. He said he was finally ready to explore something real." I almost laughed at the familiar language. David's specialty was making every woman feel was special like she was worth changing his ways for. He'd probably used similar words with me 4 years ago, convincing me that I was different from all the others. "How did you 2 meet?" I asked, settling into the armchair across from where she stood. Victoria finally took a sip of wine, her hands trembling slightly. "At a networking event downtown. He approached me at the bar, said something charming about my presentation on hospitality trends. We started talking, and he seemed so genuine, so interested in what I had to say. He asked me to dinner the next week. The pattern was exactly what I'd expected. David was methodical in his deception, probably using the same networking events and professional circles to meet women while maintaining plausible deniability about his whereabouts. Every late night at the office, every client dinner, every work emergency had likely been a carefully orchestrated date with Victoria. "Where did he take you for that first dinner?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Meridian," Victoria replied, and I nodded. Of course, our old special place now repurposed for his new romantic pursuits. He said it was his favorite restaurant, that he'd been waiting right person to share it with. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Not only had David been cheating, but he'd been recycling our memories, our special places, our intimate moments, and presenting them to Victoria as original experiences. He'd taken 4 years of our relationship and repackaged it as novelty for someone else. At 7:15, I'd David's key here in the lock. Victoria and I looked at each other, and I saw my own mixture of anticipation and dread reflected in her eyes. We about were to witness something neither of us had ever seen before. The moment when a master manipulator's carefully constructed lies collided with undeniable reality. "Rachel, I'm home!" David called out, his voice carrying that familiar tone of someone who expected everything to be exactly as he'd left it. "Sorry, I'm a bit late." Traffic was murder coming back from the client meeting. Another lie, delivered automatically. Victoria's eyes widened as she recognized the casual dishonesty, probably remembering similar explanations David had given her about his whereabouts. I stood up and walked toward the hallway, Victoria following close behind. "David," I called back sweetly. "We're in the living room. I have someone I'd like you to meet." The footsteps in the hallway stopped abruptly. I could practically hear David's mind racing, trying to process the implications of that statement. When he finally appeared in the doorway, still wearing his charcoal suit and carrying his leather briefcase, his face went through a series of expressions that would have been comedic if they weren't so devastating. First came confusion, his eyebrows furrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Then recognition, his eyes widening as he realized who Victoria was. Finally, something approaching panic, though he tried to mask it with his usual composed demeanor. "Victoria," he said, his voice carefully controlled but slightly strained. "What are you doing here?" Victoria stood up from the couch, wine glass still in her hand, her own expression a mixture of hurt and anger. "I was invited to dinner," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "By your girlfriend of 4 years." The word girlfriend hung in the air like an accusation. David's face had gone pale, and I could see him frantically calculating his options, searching for some explanation that could possibly reconcile the two he'd been worlds living in. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," David said, setting down his briefcase and loosening his tie, a nervous gesture I'd seen countless times before. "Victoria, you know the situation is complicated." "Actually, I don't," Victoria replied, her voice growing stronger. "Why don't you explain the situation to both of us?" "Because according to Rachel, you've been together for 4 years. According to you, you're single and ready to explore something real with me." David looked between us like a cornered animal, his usual confidence evaporating. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the instant when his smooth explanations and gaslighting tactics would fail him completely. There was no way to spin this, no way to make both of us doubt our own perceptions. "Rachel," he said, turning to me with desperation creeping into his voice, "you're taking this all wrong. You're being paranoid again." The word that had haunted me for months now sounded pathetic and hollow. I smiled, feeling a sense of power I hadn't experienced in our entire relationship. "Am I?" I asked calmly. "Victoria, does this seem like paranoia to you?" Victoria set down her wine glass with deliberate precision and walked closer to David. 3 months, she said quietly. 3 months you've been telling me you were single. 3 months of dinners and long conversations about building something meaningful together. 3 months of lies. David opened his mouth, probably to deploy another round of manipulation tactics, but Victoria wasn't finished. "I trusted you," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I believed you when you said you were tired of playing games, that you wanted something real. I even turned down other dates because I thought what we had was special." I watched David's face as Victoria spoke, seeing him realize that his carefully crafted persona was crumbling in real time. The confident financial analyst who could explain away any inconsistency was being replaced by someone who looked small and caught. "Both of you, please," David said, raising his hands in a gesture that was supposed to be calming but came across as pleading. "This isn't what it looks like." "Then what is it?" I asked, my voice sharp with months of suppressed anger. "Because it looks like you've been living two separate lives, lying to both of us and calling me paranoid every time I noticed something was wrong." David's shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely defeated. The mask he'd been wearing for months finally slipped completely, revealing the selfish, cowardly person underneath. Victoria turned to me, her expression softening with understanding. "He really did call you paranoid." "Every single time I questioned anything," I replied. "Every instinct I had, every observation I made, every moment I felt like something was wrong, he convinced me I was imagining it." "That's emotional manipulation," Victoria said quietly, and I realized she probably knew from experience. "Making you doubt your own perceptions so you won't trust what you're seeing." David finally found his voice again, but it came out weak and defensive. "I never meant for things to get this complicated. I care about both of you." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Victoria and I looked at each other, and I saw my own disgust reflected in her expression. After months of elaborate lies and manipulation, his defense was that he cared about us. "You care about us?" Victoria repeated, her voice rising with incredulity. "You've been lying to both of us for months. You made me believe I was special while you were going home to her every night. And you made me believe I was losing my mind," I added, my voice gaining strength with each word. "Every time I trusted my instincts, you twisted it into a character flaw. You weaponized my love for you against my own sanity." David's face cycled through expressions like a broken slideshow. Guilt, panic, calculation, desperation. I could almost see him searching for the magic words that would somehow fix this situation, the perfect explanation that would make both of us forgive him and pretend none of this had happened. "Look, I know this seems bad," he began, falling back on his familiar pattern of minimizing and deflecting. "But relationships are complicated. People grow apart. Sometimes you meet someone new and you're not sure how to handle it." Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "Handle it? You handle it by being honest. You handle it by ending one relationship before starting another. You don't handle it by creating an elaborate web of lies." I watched David flinch at her words, finally confronted with someone who wouldn't accept his carefully crafted justifications. For months, he trained me to accept less, to settle for explanations that didn't quite make sense, to suppress my questions in favor of keeping the peace. But Victoria hadn't been conditioned to accept his manipulation. She was seeing his behavior with fresh, unbiased eyes. "David," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. "Do you remember last month when I asked about the perfume smell on your shirt?" His jaw tightened. "Rachel, please don't do this now." "What did you tell me?" I continued, ignoring his plea. "You said I was being paranoid. You said it was from the elevator at work, from standing too close to strangers. You made me feel guilty for even bringing it up." Victoria's head snapped toward David, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Last month? We went to that wine tasting event at the Marriott. I was wearing my new perfume. You said you liked it. The puzzle pieces were clicking together audibly. Every lie, every deflection, every moment David had made me doubt my own perceptions was now being validated in real time. Victoria and I weren't just comparing notes anymore. We were reconstructing the elaborate fiction David had been living. "The gym membership," I said suddenly, another memory surfacing. "You started going to that new place downtown 3 months ago. Said you needed a change of scenery." Victoria nodded slowly. "That's when we started meeting for coffee after my morning workouts. You said you'd just joined to get back in shape." David's composure was completely gone now. He loosened his tie further and ran his hands through his hair, leaving it disheveled. The polished financial analyst was being replaced by someone who looked increasingly desperate and cornered. "Both of you are twisting everything," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "You're making it sound worse than it is." I was trying to figure things out. I was confused about my feelings. "Confused?" I repeated, incredulous. "For 3 months you were confused?" while you were taking her to our restaurant, using our special places, recycling our relationship for someone else? The accusation hit him like a physical blow. Victoria looked between us, her expression shifting from hurt to something approaching disgust. Our restaurant? Meridian, I confirmed. We used to go there for anniversaries, special occasions. It was our place before it became yours. Victoria set down her wine glass with enough force to make it ring against the coffee table. You took me to your anniversary restaurant? You said it was your favorite place that you'd been waiting to share with the right person. It is my favorite place, David said weakly, as if that somehow justified the deception. That's not the point, Victoria exploded, her composure finally cracking. The point is that nothing about our relationship was real. Every special moment, every meaningful conversation, every time you made me feel like I was important to you, it was all recycled from what you had with her. I felt a strange sense of solidarity with Victoria in that moment. We were both victims of the same person, both manipulated by the same tactics, both made to feel special while being systematically deceived. The anger I'd been carrying for months wasn't just about David's cheating anymore. It was about the way he'd made both of us complicit in our own betrayal. I need to know something, I said, looking directly at David. All those times you called me paranoid, all those moments when you made me feel like I was losing my mind, did you know you were gaslighting me? The question hung in the air like a challenge. David's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. His silence was more damning than any confession could have been. Victoria stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. Answer her question, David. Did you know what you were doing to her? I was trying to protect everyone, David finally managed, his voice hollow. I didn't want to hurt anyone unnecessarily. Protect everyone? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You were protecting yourself. You were protecting your ability to have two relationships without consequences. You were protecting your right to live in whatever fantasy suited you at any given moment. David's shoulders slumped in defeat. I never meant for it to go this far. How far did you mean for it to go? Victoria asked sharply. How long were you planning to keep lying to both of us? Until one of us figured it out? Until you got bored and moved on to someone else? The question seemed to break something in David's remaining composure. He sank into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. I don't know, he said, his voice muffled. I honestly don't know. For the first time since this confrontation began, I felt something approaching pity for him. Not because he didn't deserve the consequences of his actions, but because he looked so pathetic sitting there, finally forced to confront the reality of what he'd done. The confident man who'd been controlling narratives and managing perceptions for months was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely lost. But the pity lasted only a moment. Victoria was looking at the photographs scattered around the room again, her expression hardening as she processed the full scope of David's deception. 4 years, she said quietly. You've been together for 4 years, and he threw that away for what? A few months of excitement with someone new? Not threw away, I corrected. Kept as backup. He never intended to leave me. He just wanted to have both options available. David's head snapped up at that. That's not true. I never thought of you as backup. Then what was I challenged. What was your plan, David? Keep lying to both of us indefinitely? See how long you could maintain 2 separate lives? He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to realize there was no answer that wouldn't make him look worse. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of his ragged breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. Victoria walked over to where I was standing, and for a moment we just looked at each other. 2 women who'd been unknowingly sharing the same man, now united in our understanding of his deception. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I had no idea about you. If I'd known he was in a relationship, I never would have gotten involved. I nodded, believing her completely. I know. He's very good at creating separate worlds for different people. You weren't the other woman. We were both being lied to. David looked up at us with something approaching desperation. Please don't talk about me like I'm not here. Why not? I asked coldly. You talked about both of us like we didn't exist. You erased me from your life when you were with Victoria, and you erased her when you were with me. Fair is fair. Victoria turned back to David, her voice steady but final. I need to go. I can't be here anymore. She walked toward the hallway where she'd left her purse, pausing only to look back at me. Thank you for inviting me tonight. I needed to see this. I needed to understand what was really happening. I followed her to the door, leaving David sitting alone in the living room with the ruins of his carefully constructed lies. At the threshold, Victoria turned to me one more time. What are you going to do? She asked. I glanced back toward the living room where David sat motionless, probably still trying to process how completely his world had collapsed in the span of 30 minutes. I'm going to stop being paranoid, I said with a small smile, and start trusting my instincts again. Victoria squeezed my hand briefly before stepping into the hallway. Good luck, Rachel. You deserve so much better than this. After she left, I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to her footsteps fade down the corridor. The apartment felt different now, charged with the energy of revealed truth and broken illusions. When I finally closed the door and turned back toward the living room, David was still sitting in the same position, staring at his hands. She's gone, I announced unnecessarily. David looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Rachel, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can figure this out together. I walked past him toward the kitchen, beginning to clear the dinner that would never be eaten. The salmon I'd prepared so carefully was growing cold. The vegetables were starting to wilt. And the wine we'd been saving for a special occasion had been opened for the most devastating dinner party of my life. David, I said without turning around, do you remember what you told me this morning when I asked what time you'd be home? I said I might be late from work, he replied quietly. You said you had a big presentation to prep for, I corrected. But you weren't at work today. I called your office. Janet said you took a personal day. The silence that followed was deafening. David didn't try to explain or justify or deflect. He just sat there, finally understanding that every lie had been exposed, every deception revealed. How long have you known? He asked eventually. I scraped the uneaten dinner into the garbage, the sound of the fork against the plate unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment. I've suspected for months, but I've known for certain since yesterday when I saw Victoria's text on your phone. You went through my phone? I turned to face him, incredulous at his misplaced indignation. You've been living a double life for months, and you're concerned about privacy? David had the grace to look ashamed. You're right. I have no right to be upset about that. No, you don't, I agreed. Just like I had no right to doubt my own perceptions when they were telling me exactly what was happening. I continued cleaning up the kitchen, the routine tasks giving me something to do with my hands while my mind processed everything that had just occurred. David remained in the living room, occasionally making small sounds like he was about to speak, then falling silent again. Finally, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. What happens now? I looked at him, this man I'd loved for 4 years, and felt nothing but exhaustion. Not anger anymore, not hurt, just bone-deep weariness at the thought of trying to rebuild something that had been so thoroughly destroyed. Now you pack a bag and find somewhere else to stay tonight, I said calmly. Tomorrow we'll figure out the logistics of untangling 4 years of shared life. Rachel, please. Don't make any permanent decisions while you're emotional. Let's take some time to think about this. I set down the dish I'd been washing and turned to face him fully. I'm not emotional, David. I'm clear, probably clearer than I've been in months. You spent all that time convincing me I was paranoid, but it turns out I wasn't paranoid enough. He took a step closer, and I could see him shifting into the mode I knew so well. The one where he tried to manage my emotions and control the narrative. You're hurt right now, and every right to be. But you have built something together over 4 years. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It meant everything to me, I replied. That's why this hurts so much. But you can't build a relationship on lies, David. You can't gaslight someone into doubting their own reality and then ask them to trust you again. I never meant to gaslight you. I was just trying to avoid conflict. By making me think I was losing my mind every time I noticed something was wrong. David fell silent again, finally seeming to understand that there were no words that could fix what he'd broken. I returned to cleaning up the kitchen, the methodical work helping me stay grounded in the moment rather than spiraling into thoughts about everything that would need to change. "I'll pack some things," David said eventually. "But this isn't over, Rachel." "I'm not giving up on us." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said by the events of the evening. David's own actions had explained everything more clearly than any conversation ever could. As I listened to him moving around in the bedroom, gathering clothes and toiletries, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: relief. The constant low-level anxiety that had been my companion for so long was finally starting to fade. I didn't have to doubt my perceptions anymore. I didn't have to second-guess my instincts or apologize for noticing things that were right in front of me. The paranoid girlfriend David had been so concerned about was gone. In her place was someone who trusted herself completely. Someone who knew that her instincts had been right all along. When David finally left that night, carrying a hastily packed duffel bag and avoiding eye contact, the apartment felt like it was exhaling for the first time in months. I sat on the couch where Victoria had been just hours earlier, looking at the wine glasses we'd abandoned, the untouched dinner plates, the physical evidence of a confrontation that had shattered David's carefully constructed reality. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Hey, saw your Instagram story about dinner plans. How did it go with the mystery guest?" I realized I'd completely forgotten about the casual story I'd posted earlier, showing the table set for 3 with a cryptic caption about unexpected company. Now it seemed prophetic. I typed back simply, "Illuminating. We'll call you tomorrow." The next morning brought a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I woke up alone in the bed I'd shared with David for 4 years, and instead of the emptiness I'd expected, there was space. Room to breathe, room to think, room to remember who I'd been before I started doubting every instinct I had. David had left his key on the kitchen counter, along with a handwritten note that I almost threw away without reading. But curiosity won, and I unfolded the paper to find 3 pages of his familiar handwriting, full of explanations and justifications and pleas for another chance. He wrote about being confused, about not knowing how to handle developing feelings for someone else while still caring about me. He described Victoria as a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment that had spiraled out of control. He promised counseling, complete transparency, whatever it would take to rebuild what we'd had. But what struck me most wasn't his remorse or his promises. It was how, even in his apology, he was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to minimize his choices and make them sound like accidents rather than deliberate deceptions, still trying to convince me that my perceptions needed adjustment rather than acknowledging that his actions had been wrong. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with old warranties and instruction manuals. Documents that might be important someday, but weren't relevant to my current life. Then I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, planning my next steps with the methodical precision of someone who'd finally stopped second-guessing herself. The first call was to my landlord, explaining that I'd be taking over the lease entirely. The apartment had always been in both our names, but I could afford it on my own, especially without David's expensive tastes draining our shared accounts. The second call was to my bank, removing David's access to the joint checking account we'd opened 2 years ago. By noon, I'd changed the locks and arranged for David to collect his remaining belongings on Saturday when I'd be at work. I didn't want another confrontation, another opportunity for him to practice his manipulation tactics on me. The dinner party had been about revealing truth. Everything after that was just logistics. Victoria called that afternoon while I was boxing up the framed photos that had decorated our living room, the visual evidence of a relationship that had existed more in my imagination than in reality during its final months. "I wanted to check on you," she said, her voice gentle. "Last night was intense for everyone involved." "I'm okay," I replied, surprised to find that I actually meant it. "Better than okay, actually. How are you holding up?" "Angry," she admitted. "Not at you, obviously. But I keep thinking about all the conversations David and I had about trust and honesty. He was so convincing when he talked about wanting something real." I paused in my packing, a photo of David and me at his company Christmas party in my hands. He was smiling at the camera while I looked at him with obvious adoration, completely unaware that he was already planning his exit strategy. That's his specialty, I said. Making people feel like they're getting something authentic while he's performing a completely scripted role. The worst part is that I actually liked him, Victoria continued. Not just the attraction, but I genuinely enjoyed our conversations. I thought we had intellectual compatibility, shared values. Now I realize I was talking to a character he created specifically for me. I understood exactly what she meant. The David who'd lived with me for 4 years was probably just as much of a performance as the David who'd courted Victoria. The real David, if such a person even existed, was apparently someone who found elaborate deception more appealing than honest communication. That was 6 months ago. Victoria and I stayed in touch, not as close friends but as occasional coffee companions who shared the unique experience of having been deceived by the same person. She moved to Seattle for a new job opportunity, sending me a postcard that simply said, "Fresh starts feel amazing." I never heard from David again after that handwritten apology. No dramatic attempts to win me back, no surprise appearances at my workplace, no mutual friends reporting his regrets. He simply vanished from my life as completely as he'd tried to vanish me from his when he was with Victoria. Perhaps he finally understood that some bridges, once burned by deliberate deception, can never be rebuilt. The apartment feels different now. Lighter somehow, despite being filled with the same furniture and overlooking the same view of the Willamette River. I've learned to trust the quiet voice that whispers when something feels wrong. The same voice I spent months silencing because someone convinced me it was paranoia rather than perception. Looking back, I realized that dinner party wasn't just about exposing David's lies. It was about reclaiming my right to trust my own instincts, to believe my own eyes, to know that when something feels wrong, it probably is. The woman who doubted every observation, who apologized for being suspicious, who accepted gaslighting as love, she's gone. In her place is someone who knows the difference between paranoia and awareness, between jealousy and justified concern. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to argue or plead or demand explanations. Sometimes it's simply to create a space where the truth can speak for itself, where manipulators have to face the reality they've been hiding. That night, David's own face explained everything his words had tried to conceal. And I learned that I was never paranoid at all. I was just paying attention.